So you're having a hard time remembering your jiu-jitsu techniques. This is an extremely common problem that students will have, especially in the beginning of their career. In today's video, I want to go over a few tricks that I have learned that I have tried to apply in my own jiu-jitsu journey in order to help you start remembering your techniques a little bit better. How's it going, everyone? If you are new here, thank you for checking out the channel. Make sure you give this video a like. Also, hit that subscribe button if you enjoyed this type of content, and then turn on that bell icon. That way you are notified whenever the latest video comes out. When we talk about remembering our jiu-jitsu techniques, we are obviously trying to think about, well, if I can remember them better, hopefully I can start to apply that information inside of live training or in sparring or underneath of resistance. There are a bunch of debates out there in the jiu-jitsu world, from how jiu-jitsu is taught to the ecological approach to the standard way of drilling and so on and so forth. And yeah, there's just a whole deep world to that. Unless you own the school or you are the person who has the ability to make a giant recommendation and change everything, that is outside of your control. So if you like the ecological approach, but you don't train out of school that does it, then you can't make the whole school do it. And if you train out of school, that's the other way, but they do this other thing and you don't like it, well, that's outside of your control. Putting the blame on like the school or the instructor or whatever you want to do is just kind of really a waste of time and just gives you a reason to create animosity, in my opinion. So instead, what can you actually do to remember your techniques or start to apply this information in a more useful manner? First off, let's talk about what it means to remember techniques, or what we call the skill of recall. Recall is being able to generate the past memory or recall a piece of information that becomes present to your brain and that you're going to be able to use in the moment. A lot of times where this comes into play is when you're in the bottom of the mount position per se, and you're like, man, I've learned a technique here and I kind of know what to do, but I just can't remember the steps. I can't remember the moves. I just can't remember everything that goes along with it. That would be an example of maybe not very strong recalling abilities. Now, obviously, the more that you see something and the more that you practice something, the easier that recalling can be. The problem with those two lines of thinking is that if you don't see it often, if your instructor is not teaching it often, or you're missing the classes where those areas are addressed, maybe you're limited on drill time, well, then how are you going to be able to use those two as a solution? You really can't. Using our own memory and learning how we store information in our brain can be very useful. The first big tip that I like to tell students is whenever you're learning something for the first time, you should think about trying to understand the big picture about how a technique is going to be used, and then worry about the details later. What I mean by the big picture is, if you're seeing someone teach an elbow escape, learn why the elbow escape is being used, what is the scenario it's being used in, and how does the actual move work. And a lot of times people would call this the principle or the concept, but those words kind of are mystified and no one really knows what they mean. But really, it's the big picture that governs the move. Principles and concepts are conveyed through techniques. Or the first thing you have to do is, if you're instructor or you're not sure what the principle or what the concept is just understand the big picture. Okay, I see that when I'm escaping the mount or I'm doing an elbow escape, the goal is to frame on the leg, get on my side, and push their leg in between my legs. See, those were three really big goals or big picture ideas. Is there more nuance to that technique? Absolutely. There's nuance on where I need to put the frame. Does it go at the hip? Does it go on the elbow? How much do I need to get on my side? How do I get on my side? How do I actually push their leg in between my leg? Is it me physically pushing, or is it my leg scraping underneath? Is it a combination of both? So you can see how there are layers that are involved in a technique. I see a lot of times students worry about every single detail, but the first time that you're learning something, just think about, okay, what is the big picture of this thing? And try to store that big picture, that big goal into a specific part of your brain. Now, the second big thing is after you have that big picture starting to be crafted, then we can say, what is the relationship with this to what I already know? From my understanding, after doing a little bit of research on how our brains learn, it's very similar to like a spider web concept where our brains want to anchor to already previously learned information and build that connection. That's how it's efficient and how it builds those neural pathways in between. So if you can say, man, this move is very similar to this other move over here, and you start building that correlation and that connection, it actually makes the information a lot stickier. And this is where that concept of like mount escape can be very useful. So when you say like an elbow escape fits into the category of mount escapes, well, you just made a relationship connection. You could also say, hey, this mount escape is similar to this other mount escape that I know. It has a lot of similarities. Here is similar, this is similar, but there is a slight difference here and there. Now you only have to remember the big differences and not the entire technique as a whole. So starting to formulate and build those relationships in your brain really does help. When I'm watching like a seminar, for example, and I go into that and I'm seeing some techniques that I've really never seen before, I'm not really trying to remember every single thing. That'd be great if I could. I'm trying to understand the big picture of where it's used and what are other scenarios that I could see myself using this in that it's similar to. And that really kind of helps bind that information into your brain a little bit more. Then over time, if you want to go back and studying it and filling the gaps, you can use your instructor, or you can use a training partner, or drilling, or buy an instructional, or find the other details that you need to really understand to fill in those gaps and make it even that much better moving forward. So what do you guys think right now about this information? Do you have a hard time remembering techniques? Do you have any tips and tricks that you could give people? Let me know down in the comments below. The next thing is that we want to immediately apply that information if we can. What I mean by that is if I just learned how to use the elbow escape, I just saw it, and then now I'm going to be drilling it or practicing it, that is an example of applying the information. I know this is where the giant debate comes into, yeah, but he's not resisting, and that's not the exact representation of the environment that they're going to be most conducive to under pressure and all these other things. Yeah, okay, I understand that. But the idea is being able to take in that information, letting your brain process it and encoding it, and then being able to spit it out in a physical movement, which is still required at the end of the day, whether it's against the different amount of resistance. So that's going to be very, very helpful to a student. Now we can make the argument, how long do we need to drill for? When does it have no more benefit to it? There are some interesting topics and discussions about that. But regardless, applying that information as soon as possible is going to be very useful. That helps create that immediate storage of information. But really what we want is to be able to recall like long-term information. So I learned something, several months ago, and I still want to be using it to today. And I think that's where students start to kind of struggle and they have a hard time bridging the gap. Let's talk about a couple of strategies we can do to help that process. So one of the first things I personally like to do is take notes. Now, my note-taking strategy is not probably the most standard way of doing it, I would say. I'm not trying to write down every single step of the technique. Really what I'm trying to do is understand kind of the big picture and that relationship aspect that I talked about earlier. So example, if I'm seeing a new move being taught, then I'm going to try to make a note about how it connects to something I already know and a few of the key details that I need to remember about the technique, whether I use that in a word format or in a picture format, because we know that the way our brain processes pictures is a little bit different than how it takes in words. I'm not just necessarily writing out every single step like you would do in college, like step 1, do this, step 2, do this, step 3, do this. I'm not as worried about that information. I know people say, well, Chase, you're a black belt, but it's also not about remembering all the details. It's about the big picture. Taking notes is very valuable, but if you're going to be taking notes and writing down every single word that the instructor has, you're not really understanding the big benefit of the notes. It's really to mark down the key points and have that to generate that memory and help that recall and study. Now, the next thing I like to do is something I call synthesize my notes. I do this a lot because I use it for more teaching practicalities. But for example, I will take all these different techniques and I'll kind of make a list out of them. And if I'm trying to write them down, I try to use it like a matching game and create the relationships and structure them in hierarchies and orders, or compare and contrast. And when you synthesize that information, it's a higher order of learning. And we know this from the Bloom's taxonomy of learning that's been in education for quite a while, that's one of the highest forms of learning. And when you're able to pair and chunk information together, once again, it helps that stickiness. That relationship aspect that I talked about earlier becomes very beneficial when you do these activities. And this is an activity that you can actually do at home. You don't even need to be at the gym to do it, but it's going to help you generate that information a lot quicker and help that recall ability. So we know that that's how it challenges our brain. I like to do this a couple times a month. I actually am a loser and I kind of find it fun. I find it as a fun challenge game in order to improve myself. One of the best ways to help remember information is being able to teach information. Not everyone is going to have the ability to teach a group class. You're like, Chase, I'm a white belt. There's no way I could teach a group class. And you're absolutely correct on that, but you could teach what we call the invisible student or an invisible person. When you have to teach an invisible person, or you have to actually think about teaching and you have to generate the memory and take the effort to bring that stuff to the surface level, it's usually the most important factors that you need to remember and that you need to recall that are going to be essentials. You could just get out a piece of paper, and if I'm going to say, okay, well, what are the mount escapes that I know? If I was to have to teach somebody a mount escape, which ones would I pick? Why would I pick these ones? What are the key details I would have to list out of these mount escapes that I was teaching somebody? And you're going to see that you're either going to vomit all over the page, or you're able to condense and synthesize that information into very clear and concise steps. And it's okay. That takes practice and takes time, but kind of going through that process is going to help you recall that information. And so when you combine these memory tricks or these memory tasks with then you trying to do it underneath the resistance, under the changing environments, against different size of training partners and different skill levels of training partners, that's really, really important, because when you take the time to do it on the map and then you see that and you write out the information and you think you know it, then you go and you try to apply it in a live environment and you're like, man, I didn't actually have that written down on my map. I didn't know that that was a potential possibility. It makes that highlighted, like blinking light, a lot more important and easier to remember. And then I can go through and try to find solutions to that blinking light, and then I can connect it back to what I already know. And then it's just kind of a genuine cycle that keeps going about our memory and how we can continue to recall this information, and we keep building upon these skills. This is not how I started approaching jiu-jitsu. I started by taking notes, and I had a giant spiral notebook, and I would just write down every single thing that I knew. I would try to organize and categorize things by like techniques and by position. And there's a lot of different strategies to do it. I'm just giving you guys the key things that I have realized as being a jiu-jitsu black belt, and doing a little bit more deep dive into how our brain learns and how it stores information, and how we can improve our recall ability. And these are just some of the things that I have found have worked for me and have worked for my students moving forward. But 100% play around with your own. You might totally disagree with me and be like, no, it's all about the drilling. No, it's all about the rolling. None of that stuff has any value or has any benefit. And that's 100% fine. It's totally up to you. If you guys like this kind of information and you're liking getting help in this way, and you're looking for more things that you can do actually off the mat, then you'd probably be a pretty good candidate for my online coaching program. I call it the acceleration system, because we do these activities and I have you do these things in order to better understand where your jujitsu is at. But most importantly, because it's going to help you make that meaningful change in your jujitsu. It's going to help you progress your way forward. And so following some steps and then knowing, okay, I have this information. What do I actually do with it? Is extremely, extremely valuable. And that's how you can start to speed up your jiu-jitsu journey and get better and get the answers that you guys are looking for. So if that's something you think you'd be interested in, make sure you take the time to book your coaching call down below. I'd be more than happy to discuss the information with you and hopefully help you out. That is going to wrap up the end of this video. Make sure you guys check out the next video that's going to pop up right here, and I'll see you guys in the next one.